I am currently standing in central London, opposite 28 Bow Street, the site of the infamous Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Sadly, it is no longer a law court. The last case to be tried here was on the 14th of July 2006, 15 years ago, when a gentleman by the name of Jason Handy was accused of breaching his antisocial behaviour order. The former owners of the site, the Metropolitan Police Authority and the Greater London Magistrates' Courts Authority, sold the building in 2008. It changed hands a couple of times after that, although the plan was always that it would become a hotel, which has since opened, and a museum about the history of the Metropolitan Police. Bow Street is instrumental to the history and formation of the current police force, as well as being a key location within the Bow Street Society book series. What was it like back in 1896? How was it established? Well, let's go back in time and find out. Right, how do I actually do that? Clearly haven't thought this through. Oh, hang on. Hey, you in the ridiculously long scarf and hat. Can I have a lift?
I'm TG Campbell, creator of the Bow Street Society book series, and you're listening to the Bow Street Society podcast.
I am reliably informed that I have safely arrived in 1896, and it's rather strange to be in a place that is so familiar and yet so unfamiliar at the same time. The court building still towers above me, but it is much cleaner than it was when I last saw it in 125 years' time. This law court building was completed in 1881, having taken 3 years to build, but even at this time there was a history of policing in this part of London that goes back a further 157 years to 1739, when a gentleman by the name of Colonel Thomas de Vale used number 4 Bow Street to run the office of a magistrate. Someone tried to burn down the building containing his offices in 1743 after he was involved in legislation that increased the duty on gin by 5%, the so-called gin riots. This angered not just the rioters. De Vale was well known for enjoying a drink, and during the riot was escorted home from his Masonic lodge so drunk that he did not notice the riots going on around him, or even a chamber pot being emptied over his head. Nice. Colonel de Vale got a reputation for being one of the first honest magistrates from some quarters. Up until this point, it was common practice for magistrates to take bribes to influence the outcome of the cases. Some sources, however, suggest that he had a penchant for prostitutes and would offer leniency in their trials in return for a freebie. Either way, one thing is certain. Colonel de Vale was one of the men that helped to create the first police force and justice system that were considered professional here in England.
My goodness, you poor man.
Sorry?
What in heavens did those robbers do to you? Look at your trousers. They are ripped to pieces and stained a ghastly blue. Oh, your hat and coat. The only item of clothing they have left intact is your vest. Isadora, fetch a constable at once.
No, I'm fine. Really, I could do with some new clothes though. Could you recommend anywhere local?
One moment. Isadora informs me that Sucker's department store on Oxford Street is a good choice. She says it's had a change in management, but is affordable. It is quite a distance, I'm afraid, but Isadora said one may hire a cab from the High Holborn shelter. Whatever that is.
Thanks. I guess jeans and a t-shirt do make me stand out in 1896. But what am I going to do for money? Ooh, what's that on the floor? Is that a wallet? Wow, it is indeed. Manufactured by McGuffins and Sons according to the card in it, and that's £10. Is that enough? I guess I'll find out. Well, after a lengthy trip to Suggett's department store and a few lurid tales from locals about the history of the place, don't buy the soap, I am back at the end of Bow Street. The aforementioned office of Colonel de Vale was occupied by various magistrates over the years. Magistrate John Paulson held the position after the death of de Vale in 1746, and he was replaced 2 years later by Henry Fielding. Henry was a fair magistrate. He did not feel that his office was there simply to make money out of the poor, and he gained a reputation for fairness and impartiality. He even took account of people's social background when making judgments, and admitted that some people in society were forced into crime because it was the only way that they could survive. The income from his office actually went down rather than up during this period when he refused to take money from people who could not afford to pay it. His half-brother John helped him at the office, and in 1749 they set up London's very first police force, the Bow Street Runners. Before this, private citizens enforced the law, the so-called thief-takers, who solved crime and brought people to justice for a mercenary fee. It was a system open to corruption, so having a professional group was a huge step forward. Their job was initially to issue writs and make arrests. They were not visibly walking a beat like modern police. There were, however, issues. Some were still behaving like the thief-takers and were just as corrupt, and they only got paid with money from rewards on recovered stolen property. In 1753, the Bow Street Runners almost fell apart. They stopped performing their thief-catching roles, and when the Secretary of State asked for Henry Fielding's advice on what to do to reduce the amount of money being paid out by the government in rewards, he suggested an increase in his budget to, amongst other things, pay his runners. He also used the money to advertise their activities and encourage the public to report crimes to his office, as well as pay clerks to keep records on everything that happened, although they were not employed on a permanent basis. Henry died in Portugal in 1754. It is believed that his commitment to justice had an impact on his health. He was in Portugal to get a cure for one of his ailments and died a couple of months later in pain and mental distress. His half-brother, Sir John, was appointed his successor and continued the work that Henry had started. Because he was blind, he was nicknamed the Blind Beaker Bow. Sir John managed to negotiate a substantial increase in funds for his runners. In 1753, Henry was receiving £200 per year. By 1765, under Sir John, it had gone up to £600 per year. Sir John had 6 officers whose job was to investigate and make arrests, and he could now also afford permanent clerks for the office as well. Number 4 Bow Street was not a 24-hour operation like the police we know today, but it came close. It was described as being open for most of the day, most days, and when Sir John was not present, there was someone there who offences could be reported to. It was during this time that records about crimes and criminals were combined, creating the first criminal database that officers could use to help them. Sir John also set up the first courtrooms as we know them today, where suspects could be examined and with an audience present. Number 4 Bow Street was no longer just the house of the magistrates, it was now the Bow Street Magistrates' Court. Many justices worked there, and it stayed open for long hours. Sir John encouraged members of the press to attend the hearings, which were soon covered in a weekly report into the cases seen. In the 1760s, horse-mounted patrols were introduced, although thanks to their cost, the number soon dwindled down to just 2. Sir John died in 1780, 116 years before the time I'm currently standing in, and well before the Bow Street Society books are set, but his legacy was a much fairer, regulated police system. But how did the Bow Street Runners become the Metropolitan Police Force? When did 4 Bow Street stop being the Bow Street Magistrates' Court? I will continue telling the story of Bow Street and its involvement in the formation and evolution of the police force in a future show.
Good afternoon, sir. My, that is much better.
Sorry?
Your new clothes. I trust you found Suggett's department store?
Oh, yes, thank you. Can I do something for you?
Well, now that you are properly attired, I would like to invite you to tea with me and my niece.
Would you?
Yes, she is seeking a husband, and you would be most suitable.
Oh, okay. I forgot. I bought some soap for you.
Ugh, get it away from me. Isadora, take me home.
No? Thought not.
I'm Richard A. Boxshall, and you're listening to the Bow Street Society podcast. Hello and welcome back to Bow Street in the year 1896. Last time I was standing outside the courtroom building. This time I'm sending you this report from inside a cell in the police station, which occupies the adjacent part of the same building. It seems like the lady I met last time took exception to me buying her soap as a gift and told the police I was a crazy man out to get her. They immediately arrested me and threw me into this lovely hotel room with ensuite bucket. Rather like the prisoner next door, it stinks of urine and worse, and the walls do not look like they have ever been cleaned. I will try and continue this report uninterrupted, but unfortunately I'm in the cell next door to a drunk called Mad Bob, so there may be the occasional unavoidable interruption from him.
Shut your mouth, I've got a headache.
See? Last time we looked at the foundation of the Bow Street Magistrates' Courts. not yet in the famous location at number 28 Bow Street, but at number 4. Our story ended with the death of Sir John Fielding, who held the position of magistrate until 1780, leaving a less corrupt and fairer system of justice in place. However, the year in which he died was literally a riotous year, with 400 people being killed, 150 houses and shops destroyed, and the Bank of England being attacked in one single event in June, the aftermath of which saw the courtroom itself attacked. Property from the building was taken outside and burnt. The landlord of a nearby public house, the Brown Bear, sought to calm things down by giving out free gin, but it had the opposite to the intended effect. Newgate Jail was torched and the rioters set the prisoners free. There were several factors in this era that led to a breakdown of law and order on the streets of London. There was a major rise in crime rates that were exacerbated by the recent American War of Independence. Firstly, there were a lot of unemployed soldiers that were no longer required now that that war was over, and secondly, the British had been sending their convicted felons over to America and were no longer able to do so. This meant the prisons became full, and also some convicts were still being sentenced to transportation as a sanction, even though there was actually nowhere to send them. The authorities effectively lost control of the streets in the riots in 1780, and the government's response was to create a government department called the Home Department in 1782, which was primarily responsible for law and order. One of the very first acts of this new department was to fund new salaried foot patrols. The idea came from Sampson Wright, who was John Fielding's successor as Chief Magistrate. The new foot patrols were armed, and their principal job was to prevent highway robberies. Based at Bow Street, these 46 men were split into groups who regularly patrolled the main routes in and out of the city each and every night.
Oi, you in there? You want a drink?
Well, I'd love a cup of tea.
Stand against the wall.
OK.
There you go.
Thank you. Oh. Well, it's brown and hot, but I'm not sure I'd call it tea, though. Oh, God, what is this? Has it ever actually seen a tea bag?
What's a tea bag? Like or lump it, mate. Oi, Bob, drink?
Brandy! Please, officer.
I can do tea.
I wouldn't call this tea. It's got lumps floating in it.
Shut it. Bob, there's no brandy.
Bugger off, then.
Fine. In 1785, the Home Department tried to pass a new bill. It was snappily titled, "A Bill for the Further Prevention of Crimes and for the More Speedy Detection and Punishment of Offenders against the Peace in the Cities of London and Westminster, the Borough of Southwark and certain parts adjacent to them." It failed for a large number of reasons. Part of the bill aimed to create paid police commissioners throughout the city, but the Lord Mayor saw this as an infringement of his own powers and authority, as did the various magistrates across the metropolis. The bill was never passed, but 7 years later the Middlesex Justices Act did make it through Parliament, and it did contain some elements of the 1785 bill. Public offices were created, allowing magistrates and only magistrates to administer criminal law throughout the city. And the Act also increased the power of the police forces. The new structure was based on the example that had been set by John Fielding at Bow Street. The model he created was now duplicated throughout London. Bow Street itself was in a privileged position due to its link to the Home Department, but this was a double-edged sword. Because the Home Department funded the runners, they also sought to use them for additional tasks not in their original remit, and soon the runners were engaged in other duties, such as investigating threats to national security. As a result, they spent a lot less time giving evidence in court, but by and large this model of policing was used from 1795 until well into the next century. However, the magistrate Joel Colquhoun persistently argued that there ought to be one professional police force operating in London rather than each magistrate employing his own men. People who disagreed argued that it would be the first steps to a totalitarian state, but in 1798 Colquhoun created the Thames River Police to protect cargo coming into the city, and he even opened a police station in Wapping, the very first police station in the world. In the early 1800s, crime rates diminished and the runners also went into decline. The 1792 law creating new patrols meant that these men did a lot of the work that the runners had previously done. The responsibilities decreased further when the Home Department, now also known as the Home Office, finally created a unified police force to operate across the city. The Metropolitan Police was established in 1829 and further reduced the role of the policing carried out directly on behalf of the Bow Street magistrates by the runners and patrols. In fact, over the next few years, the patrol was absorbed into the police force, leaving only the runners, who were still used primarily by the Home Office anyway. Like all government departments, the Home Office was concerned about how much money was being spent, and by the 1830s they had considerably reduced the funding available for the runners. Then, in 1834, a parliamentary committee suggested that the runners should be incorporated with the Metropolitan Police as quickly as possible. This never actually happened, but another committee 2 years later finally resulted in the renewal of the Police Act, which expanded the powers the new force had been given in 1829, making the Bow Street runners redundant. They had managed to coexist with the new Metropolitan Police for 10 years, but now, finally, they were defunct. In the final part of this look at Bow Street and how it influenced the creation of the police force that we know today, I will look at the creation of the Metropolitan Police itself. What happened to change attitudes away from thinking it would be a bad thing, the sign of a government trying to exert unnecessary control over its people? Find out next time. That's if I ever get out of here. Officer! Officer! What's going on now?
There's nobody there. They're going to leave us here to die.
Don't be ridiculous, Bob. No, they're not. That's the alcohol talking.
Alcohol doesn't talk. And if it did, it would only say one thing.
I'm not sure I should ask, but what would it say?
It would say, "Drink me, Bob. Put me in your mouth and down your throat. Shall we sing a song?"
No.
This little pig went to market. This little pig stayed at home.
Oh, for God's sake, shut up! I'll see you all next time if I don't commit a murder before then. Bob, will you please shut up? Shut up, for God's sake! Get some sleep or something! Bob, shut the f*** up!
Hello, I am Miss Rebecca Trent, and you are listening to the Bow Street Society podcast.
For this third and final piece on the history of Bow Street, I'm standing inside the famous Bow Street Magistrates' Court, located at 28 Bow Street. The date is the 29th of September 1896, and this building is less than 20 years old and houses both the Magistrates' Courts and the Bow Street Police Station, where I was lucky enough to spend some time in the previous instalment of this feature. The first Metropolitan Police patrols walked the streets exactly 67 years ago today. In 1797, the magistrate Patrick Colquhoun wanted a professional force to police London, but it was argued that it would make people feel as though they were being repressed by the government, and as such was a bad idea. There were also fears that they could be corrupted to work against the establishment, as had happened in post-revolutionary France. It took a specific sequence of events to change that mindset, and it happened gradually. The first major event that shaped the collective state of mind that eventually enabled the formation of a professional police force took place in the year 1811. Near to Wapping was a street called the Ratcliffe Highway, which had a reputation of being one of the worst streets in the city. Brothels lined the streets, and it was close to the notorious executioner's dock, where pirates were disposed of by being tied to posts and left to drown as the tide came in. Number 29 was a draper's shop. Timothy Marr tried to make an honest trade and lived behind the shop with his wife, their 3-year-old son, a 13-year-old apprentice and a servant girl. On Saturday, the 7th of December, Marr closed the shop and sent the servant girl, Margaret, out to buy oysters. She got back 30 minutes later and found that she was unable to access the property, and after a watchman had knocked on the door in an attempt to attract some attention, a neighbour offered to go to the back of the property and find out what was happening. When he got there, the back door was open, and when he went in, he found the apprentice dead on the floor. The bones of his face were smashed, and his brains had been deliberately pulverised and cast about the walls and across the shop counters. Marr's wife was also there, dead, with horrific head wounds. Timothy Marr was found behind that counter, battered to death, but most heinously, the body of the baby was found with his throat slit so savagely he was virtually decapitated. The motive was believed to be an attempt to steal Marr's savings, but these were discovered in the shop untouched. The tool used to commit the atrocity was found at the scene and bore the initials JP. These murders caused such a degree of panic that a huge reward was offered to identify the culprit, the equivalent in those days to almost 10 years' wages for the average working man. 8 days later, and before the culprit was identified, the landlord of the King's Arms Tavern on New Gavel Lane in Wapping was found hanged in his own cellar, along with the battered bodies of his wife and servant who had had their throats slit. The landlord of the Pear Tree public house, no doubt incentivised by the gigantic reward, identified the owner of the murder weapon for the Marr murders as one of his lodgers, a John Peterson. When the King's Arms murder suspect was arrested, he turned out to be another Pear Tree lodger, one John Williams. The evidence against him was slender, and Williams apparently committed suicide in his cell 6 days after being imprisoned, despite showing no behaviour consistent with depression or suicidal tendencies in the days leading up to his death. John Peterson was never prosecuted. The modern theory is that Williams was not the only person involved in the murders and was killed in his cell and made to look like he'd taken his own life to stop him from revealing other people that were involved. It is certainly true that evidence that other people were involved was ignored, and John Williams was proclaimed the sole murderer. His body was paraded through Wapping, propped up on the back of a cart. 10,000 people watched as he was taken past the Mars shop, where someone turned his head to make it look as though he was observing the scene of his crime. These two gruesome sets of killings were in fact the 7th and 8th killings in the area, and thanks to the terror that all this caused in the local community, people started to believe in the idea of, and indeed start to demand, that there was a proper city-wide police force, although members of the House of Lords still protested against the idea on libertarian grounds. However, a plan to murder every member of the cabinet in 1820, which was known as the Cato Street Conspiracy, was foiled by, amongst others, a squad of 12 Bow Street runners. The conspirators were publicly hanged and then had their heads chopped off. Some in the crowd supported the conspiracy, however, and the skill with which the men's heads had been removed led these supporters to think that the executioner may have been the surgeon Thomas Wakely, so that night they tried to burn his house down. Although severely injured, Wakely survived. The Cato Street Conspiracy strengthened calls for a professional police force, and in 1821 there were riots following the death of Queen Caroline, the estranged wife of the Prince Regent. Although not always popular, the public thought the Prince Regent's refusal to allow her to attend his coronation was inexcusable. And when she died the following year, there was such an outpouring of grief that it was feared her funeral would turn into a riot. To avoid this, it was decided that the funeral cortege, taking her body to the port of Harwich so she could be buried in Germany, would bypass London. But the Queen's subjects had other ideas and massed in numbers to try and force the procession through the capital. A magistrate that was there sanctioned the use of armed force, and 50 shots were fired against the protesters. 2 people died, but the numbers present were so great that the cortege was forced to go through the city. Public and political opinion swayed as a result of the murders, the conspiracy, and the debacle of the Queen's funeral and other events, and the Home Secretary, Sir Robert Peel, drew up the Act that finally created the Metropolitan Police in 1829. As I mentioned in the last segment, the Bow Street Runners existed side by side with the police force for a further 10 years until the organisation was finally disbanded in 1839. The building that I'm standing in now was built between 1878 and 1881, although the stonework above the door bears the year 1879, which was the year in which they were hoping the building was completed, even though it was not, and work dragged on for a further 2 years. The building housed both the Magistrates' Court and the police station, each of which occupied that space for over a century. Many famous or infamous people passed through Bow Street over the years before it closed, often before committal for trial, and these included the Cray twins, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, Dr. Crippen, Lord Haw-Haw, Oscar Wilde, General Pinochet, and Abu Hamza el-Masri. The Bow Street Police Station was finally closed after 109 years of operation in 1990, and the Magistrates' Court closed 16 years later in 2006. The building is now a hotel, although a portion of what was once the police station is now a museum that charts the history of both establishments. Well, I have enjoyed my time here in 1896, but it's now time for me to return to the 21st century. I have visited this amazing building, been to a shop where I bought some soap that turned out to contain some human fat, so we won't talk about that, been thrown into the police cells, released, and listened to a drunk singing a song. Badly. My contact that will help me return home told me all that I need to do now is stand on the street corner outside the courts and sing I'm a Little Teapot whilst doing the actions, and he will pop up and return me to my own time. I really hope I'm not going to look foolish. Here goes. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here's my handle, here's my spout. When I get all steamed up, hear me shout. Tip me up and pour me out. Yeah, right. He said he'd be here straight away.
Are you all right, dear?
Yes. Thank you.
Why are you saying that you're a little teapot?
Well, I'm told that if I use that sequence of words at that location, I'll create a time transponder in order for my friend to locate me and take me back to the future.
I used gin to do that. You ought to try it. You'll look less ridiculous.
No, it will definitely work. I was promised. I'll try again. I'm a little teapot, short and stout. Here's my handle, here's my spout. For God's sake.
You have been listening to the Bow Street Society podcast. It was written and presented by T.G. Campbell and Richard A. Boxshall.
Special thanks to all the contributors, including Sabrina Poole, Phil Rowe and Jaden Brandliff.
You can find out more about the Bow Street Society series by T.G. Campbell at bowstreetsociety.com. You can also find out more through social media. Search for Bow Street Society on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube.
Thank you for listening.
All podcast content is the intellectual property of T.G. Campbell.